like, they laid the groundwork for what I'm really excited about is our panel discussion. So for this panel discussion, we wanted to have a conversation that both allowed for people on the panel and in the audience to process the last year that we've experienced as a community. But we also wanted to create a space that was forward-looking, that reconciled our shared experience over the past year with our longer history and what that all means when it comes to answering the question, where do we go from here? So with that in mind, I'm really excited to introduce the array of organizations from across the country and their leaders who set aside time to speak with us. Here with us today are Kalyan Mendoza, the Director of U.S. Programs for Nonviolent Peaceforce, Dr. Russell Jeung, co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and a professor at San Francisco State University, Sarah Wan, Executive Director of CYC San Francisco, Satjeet Kaur, Executive Director of Sikh Coalition, and Stephanie Cho, Executive Director, AAJC Atlanta, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. So with that, I'd love for all of them to be unmuted, and it would be great if we could just do a brief round of introductions before getting into some of the questions. We can start with you, Kalyan.
Hi, everyone. Robbie, Asian American Federation, Congresswoman Grace Meng, and everyone that's on the call. Thank you so much for being in this space. My name is Kalyan Mendoza. I'm a queer Filipino, hard of hearing immigrant, street medic, human rights defender, etc. Currently at Nonviolent Peaceforce. Nonviolent Peaceforce builds protection strategies alongside local communities in violent conflicts. And I'll check it to the next person.
Great. Sarah, I feel like you're the second on my screen. Would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So glad to be here. I'm the Executive Director of Community Youth Center of San Francisco. We've been providing violence prevention and intervention services since our start, our organization since 1970. And with the Stop AAPI Hate campaign since last year, we've been providing victim support services on the ground and serving over 50 victims since February. And it's definitely my great opportunity to be here on this panel to share our practice.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Stephanie from Advancing Justice Atlanta. Oh, still getting used to Zoom. There you go. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Cho. I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. I've been here for 6 years. I'm queer. I'm a mom. I don't know. And I want to give a shout out to the Coulter Foundation for really investing in us really early on. One of the reasons why we were able to react in moments of crisis around the election and then also with the shooting was because we had this sustained, really general operating money from a very, very early on stage. And so I think, when we're talking more in our discussions, really talking more about how foundations can really be supportive and be partners in looking at the future of what we want our AAPI movement to look like.
Thank you. And Satjeet?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to all the organizers, foundations, and folks on this call joining. Really appreciate it. My name is Satjeet Kaur. I'm the Executive Director for the Sikh Coalition. We are the largest civil rights organization serving the Sikh community across the country, and we use a very grassroots first model to do high impact litigation work, advocacy, community organizing, K-12 education, and media work in an effort to protect civil rights for the Sikh community, but in effect do it for all communities and use that as precedent setting. And we were founded right after 9/11, so really understanding what it means to be created out of crisis. And massive patterns of hate is truly something that's embedded in our org as well. So yeah, happy to have this conversation here today and happy that you all are joining.
Thank you so much, Satjeet. And Dr. Jeung?
Everyone, I'm Professor Russell Jeung. I teach at San Francisco State Asian American Studies. It's the oldest program in the nation and largest possibly. And last year we created Stop AAPI Hate, like the Sikh Coalition, created out of crisis. we want to build a multiracial movement to stop racism, but actually move towards racial justice. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation this morning. And thanks for inviting me to this distinguished panel. It's sort of cool.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, I'm really excited to have all of you. And I think across all the work that you're doing, we cover the spectrum of organizing and advocacy and research that backs it all up and ties all the narratives together. So I'm really interested in, over this entire conference, there's been a lot of conversation around solidarity, and it's a word that can be used a lot of different ways, and there are so many different relationships people have to that term and what it implies for them. So I think just as a grounding question, at the risk of the conversation already going off the rails, how do all of you relate to that term, especially over the past year that we've been dealing with as a community, but also in your work where the professional and the personal are really easily blurred? What has that term meant to you over the past year and going forward? Anyone? I keep forgetting I have to ask everyone to unmute. Here
we go. I can start.
Just dive right in. I'm sorry.
To break the silence. So for the organization as a whole, one of the things that we think about in our work, right? Again, we serve a specific community. But how do we do this in a way that has impact across all communities? And we're thinking about all marginalized communities. And so we really go back to this value in the Sikh community. It's in a prayer that we say every day. It says at the very end, Sarbat Tapala, which means for the betterment of all. And that's how we apply our work, like our philosophy to our work and the lens that we use every single day. Like, how do we think about the betterment for all? And so we do that in a couple of different ways. And I think this is like, as we do annual plans as organizations, as we think about the work that we're doing, like, how do we apply this lens to all facets of our work? So the way that we as an organization do this is when we're doing high impact litigation, you're working on behalf of like a client or a family. That being said, how are you working with that individual to think about advocacy and policy changes that will impact that entire community, right? So if you're working in a school, it's not just about achieving justice for a student who is bullied, but also making sure that that administration changes policies that will impact the entire student body. When we're thinking about advocacy and policy work, right? Like, we've spearheaded bills that we make sure other communities are included in, right? So when hate crime tracking wasn't working for the Sikh community, it also wasn't working for the Arab or the Hindu community as well, and making sure that they were included in that policy change. When we think about messaging, like, how do we do a better job? And this is like, you're always course correcting as well. But after 9/11, one of the things that was coming up a lot was people were interviewing us right from the beginning and still do. And it's like, okay, well, this is really a case about mistaken identity, right? So if you just tell folks that you're not Muslim, like, that should solve the problem. No, because no community should be targeted, right? And so how are we thinking about our messaging as an organization and then teaching our community to fall along with that message, right? It's almost natural to say, if somebody says, well, yeah, you shouldn't be targeted because you're not Muslim, right? It's really easy to respond back and say, yeah, we're Sikhs, we're not Muslims, we're not terrorists. And even if you don't mean anything problematic by that, it's a problematic statement to make. And so how do we actually teach the community? And so really, we continuously try to look at all lenses of our work and think about how do we apply that message for betterment of all.
That's really interesting. I love that. Yeah, and being Indian myself, I think I really resonate with how it operates within our community and those internal complexities, how we relate to that. Dr. Jeung, I know you had something to say.
Yeah, I like to echo Satjeet's notion of solidarity as being a concern for all and broadening a perspective. And for me, solidarity through this current crisis has been what's kept me going, right? For me, it's solidarity with the past, present, and future. So we know we at Stop API are building on the legacy of resistance, from Chinese exclusion, Japanese American incarceration to Islamophobia after 9/11. And so we just are standing on those shoulders. Really, we actually strategize with, activists from the Vincent Chin struggle. So we're so grateful for the past and, the lessons learned. And I think because we've learned so much from hotel battles, from immigration and refugee deportation struggles, that we've been able to be a little bit prepared. In the present, like Satjeet said, I think it's for us solidarity with the marginalized, with other communities of color has been really key. Learning from Black Lives Matter, learning, making sure that targeted populations in our community, like undocumented elderly, are really protected, has been at the forefront for us. And then thinking about the future, it's solidarity with our young people. They've been inspiring. They, like Sarah will talk about, they've been leading the way and giving us recommendations and policy ideas and identifying what are the key issues that they're facing in their schools. And so solidarity, again, has been like a key value that's propelled us and has kept us going.
That's great. And I think one thing we want to touch upon is like that this entire history and how this moment really ties to previous narratives of anti-Asian hate. Like this definitely was not the first wave. And a lot of us come from families who share that legacy of having to deal with anti-Asian hate in all these different forms. So it's how do we apply those lessons? I could just keep repeating how much I love these responses. Stephanie, would you like to go next?
Yeah.
It's a really broad question.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been through so much. I mean, I think just kind of collectively thinking about this panel, sort of like wrapping up, you know, getting things ready for the end of this year, you know, I forget sometimes it's like, okay, we were in Georgia, we were in the runoffs, you know, the beginning part of the year, right? It was the runoffs. And we had this massive group of folks, and talk about solidarity. We like basically created these dream teams to come and help us with this massive effort that was happening. And everyone that we asked and volunteered, everyone said yes, you know, even if they were far away, which I felt like really started the year off with like some great solidarity. Then moving forward, we have, you know, everything else that happened, and then the shooting, right? And then the sort of flashpoint that happened in Atlanta, and where our organization was, I think we were able to work really fast and really concise and triage things really well, because we had dealt with so much backlash and hate before that. And so even if we came out against, you know, anti-immigrant bills that come up in Georgia every year, you know, we are prepared for that. And I was personally prepared for it too. But I think the difference that happened with this is that, you know, it impacted people in such a global way. And I think it could have happened anywhere. And I think that was the fear that people had, is that this could have happened, you know, in my town or wherever. And then, you know, moving forward now, and I'm excited to get into this conversation more, is sort of like, what do we want our future movement to look like? And this is really a great opportunity to look at what we used from the past, what is our present moment without the trauma, right? So we've had a little time to you know, sort of collect ourselves, at least in Atlanta, and then also to think about what are some real policies and real changes that we want to see forward. And then it's like, how do we want different people to help us along the way, right? And that's what I'm excited to hear more about from everybody else on this panel.
I'm excited to hear from you about it. Yeah, that's great. And Sarah, how do you relate to the term solidarity in your work and just everything that we've been through?
Sure. I think to echo what Professor Jeung has mentioned, we really see that young people has played a very important part of this role, how to build solidarity really across racial, but not only across racial, but also within their own family and also within their own community. I think when we first started, we were really providing a lot of like support and training, and also understanding, also safe space for young people to discuss the term about solidarity. And they really become the community ambassador and really the messenger and bring it home. And what we didn't expect is there has been a lot of tension and conflict when they bring up that issue with their parents, with their grandparents. And we really learned a lot along the process, how we should support our young people to have these conversations with their family who have experienced a lot of traumas, whether it's through cultural or historical or their immigrant experience. And we also have with our young people, how we can continue to be persistent in really educating, and also how to do better messaging so that their parents and their grandparents can better understand why it's so important to really build solidarity across communities. We also have the young people as a forefront to give recommendations, to give input and feedback, how we can really better support and to have a safe school for all when when schools start after this pandemic, we really worry about the spike of bullying in school. And we already seen that online already. So this has been very important how we can actually hear from young people directly, and they will be the implementer to make the change and be the champion at the school ground. I think the other level for community-driven levels, that CYC is also part of the Asian Pacific Islander Council, where we actually were able to have a space for all the API community serving organizations that come together, that have a space to discuss about this topic, how to build solidarity and how to really embrace the differences and have open conversations. Our partner like Chinese Progressive Associations, they will also have like staff exchange that are going to start across different organizations that they can come together to talk about how we can actually build a better pathway or space or sessions with, especially with the Black community organizations together to have an honest dialogue to how to deal with all the challenges we'll be facing in building solidarity. And we know it will be a long-term work to moving forward.
Thank you so much, and I think you're getting at something that I'm really excited to hear more about, is the kind of the generational dynamics of movement building, and especially this moment we're in right now. I know that came up in our conversation and came up in our conversation, Stephanie. I'm really excited to hear more about that. But finally, I want to hear from Kalyan about all of the on the ground work you've been doing. I'm sure this has been something that is a reminder in every day of your work.
Yeah, solidarity to me is power with, not power over. When we look at the last 18 months, what we've seen has been a negligent response from the white settler colonial state. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens. I'm about two blocks away from Elmhurst Hospital. At the start of this pandemic, I remember seeing my neighbors being brought from their houses in body bags into refrigeration trucks. And one thing that came up over and over again is that we were left behind. And one thing that we saw were community members, neighbors, people that never really talk to each other, start finding gaps in how the state has neglected us in caring for each other. In the last 18 months, in the shadow of the pandemic, in the shadow of the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing murders of murders of Black people across the country, we have seen an uprising that is based both in mutual aid and mutual protection. It's through this reimagining of what a better world can look like that I feel many people are finding points of solidarity. In 2015, Dr. Angela Davis and Grace Lee Boggs spoke at UC Berkeley talking about visionary organizing. What is the world that we are looking to build? We need to move away from just protest organizing and just responding, and actually reimagining what safety looks like for our communities. At Nonviolent Peaceforce, we talk about the primacy of local actors. That means really listening to those on the ground that are directly affected by issues, whether that's in Myanmar, the Philippines, Iraq, or South Sudan, and now here in the US. We really have to be able to follow the leadership of local leaders to come up with community-led solutions to the egregious ongoing human rights violations against all of our communities. And I just want to give a plug to Daisy's Rising Up and Moving. They created a document about the 5 stages of solidarity. Initially, I'll just keep it quick, but we need to move away from just symbolic solidarity to transformational solidarity. And what that looks like is not just the holding up of signs, but really looking at how do we bring the resources from the communities that have them to the communities that don't. Because the only way that we will get through this living nightmare together is really side by side and alongside each other.
Thank you so much, Kalyan. And I think one thing I'm really excited about is that all of the, not just the direct work, but the spectrum of advocacy that all the organizations here today do, it's really, you hear a lot of rhetoric, and it's really easy to tweet out, using the right words, but, you talking about applying that rhetoric actively every day in the organizing. I know you've been doing anti-Asian hate trainings with us. Like, it's actually applying that rhetoric that's actually the tough part, and that we're actually being really strained to do in real time. So I really want to hear more about that. But I think when I was drafting these panelist questions, one thing I was thinking about, in all of our pre-interviews, I think we hit on, how there's some sort of inflection point in how our community is organizing, or what's going to be asked of our community to sustain this advocacy, that we have this moment that we need to share and make visible and sustain this momentum somehow to get palpable policy changes. So my first question is for Satjeet. So we talked in our pre-interview about the need for cross-cultural dialogue within the Pan-Asian community, like about the need to not only address anti-Asian hate as a whole, but also to have the most impacted individual communities like the Sikh community after the Indianapolis shooting, make sure that they're leading the dialogue or shaping the conversation. And can you speak more to that? That was honestly fascinating to me because, you know, at the Asian American Federation, we are a Pan-Asian organization, and there are all these individual communities. And how do we surface those conversations, or how do we surface those communities, and how are you activating that in your work?
Yeah. So I think with, you know, conversations of solidarity, and I think this gets to the point that Kalyan, you just made, right? Like there's stages of solidarity, and there's also layers of solidarity. And not all solidarity means, it's really quick sometimes to be like, yeah, we're standing together, right? But if we really look at the Asian American community, we are a diverse community, right? And if you even just look at East Asian versus South Asian versus Pacific Islander versus Hawaiian, right? Like there are a lot of differences in just those larger groupings. And then like, let's just go to South Asia because that's where I'm from, right? In India alone, you have like what, 26 national languages? Like I can't understand the state over from me. Unless we're both speaking English, right? And so the diversity in our communities is real. The historical challenges and conflicts that exist amongst our communities is real. And so when we're talking about solidarity, there's also a lot of steps that are required in learning from one another, taking a step back to be inclusive of one another, understanding that not everyone is going to feel comfortable with one another in the room. And then also taking stock of like, yeah, hate has happened in waves in this country since the very beginning. But if we're just talking about the Asian community since we've started, right? And so what have we learned from each other through these processes? So I'll give a couple of examples, right? It was really striking for me when I was invited to be at the signing of the COVID-19 hate crimes bill, right? And it was incredible to see all the Asian American faces, but it was also really evident to see the lack of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian faces in the room that had actually been doing the organizing for the Kala Jabara Heather Heyer No Hate Act for many years before. And that is a huge chunk of the Asian community that was actually missing in the room. And it was really evident at that point. And so just thinking about, right, post 9/11, it's not just the Sikh community, right, the larger South Asian community, Muslim Arabs, right? And there's a lot of intersectionality with all of our identities, and like there's a lot of crossover there. Just recognizing like just in the last 20 years, like this has already happened. And you know, the impact that social media organizing has right now didn't actually exist right after 9/11, right? We're talking about Yahoo group organizing, AOL organizing at that moment. And so, you know, there's a lot of lessons that I think could have been learned if there was more conversation happening like at the beginning of all of this. And so I actually think part of solidarity work right now is actually taking a pause and like reflecting on like, hey, what have we actually learned over the last 20 years, especially from these other groups who have been through these cycles in recent history, and like how do we apply that moving forward before starting from scratch. And so, yeah, I think I know I'm going off on a couple of different tangents here, but I think that is actually really important about solidarity work. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, it's really easy to say like, hey, we all stand together, right? But oftentimes in larger coalition building, certain groups sometimes do get left out still, right? And they need to advocate for their own, or we'll say, hey, we're advocating for everybody, but we don't understand what the implications of that advocacy actually mean, right? So for example, if, you know, the ACLU or a Muslim organization decides like, hey, it's okay to do, you know, wear a hat over a hijab for certain workplaces, like, and that should be fine for the Sikh community. And if you're not checking in with the Sikh community, like you could actually create some really problematic policy. And and I would, and our organization would be like, oh no, absolutely not. We do not put hats over our turbans, right? And so just from like a real implication point of view, like understanding that different communities have different needs, recognizing that we're not all experts in everything, and making sure we're thinking about the implications that it has across the board. And what it means for the individuals who actually have to live with the decisions that we make.
Interesting. And I think you said something that's really important. I'm already going off script for the question that I've written, but I think you mentioned, over the past 20 years, what have we learned? And I know it came up in my conversation with Stephanie and Kalyan, all the things that a 20 or 30-year-old today has lived through, like all of these formative experiences that they've had to navigate, being in a country that's been defined by 9/11. Almost. I'll probably just come out and say that a lot of it's been defined by that singular event. But for Kalyan, I'm interested, over the past 20 years, a lot of the work you've done in mutual protection, what are some of the lessons you've derived from other movements? How has your work evolved, I guess, over the past 20 years? Like, obviously, Satjeet mentioned it's dramatically different landscape now than it was after 9/11. So I'm interested in hearing how your work has evolved, especially on the ground.
Yeah, so mutual protection to me is about solidarity. It's not about saviorism. I think that's one thing that we've seen a lot when organizations or individuals don't actually connect or are from the directly impacted communities or targeted communities. They tend to be to try to create solutions that aren't solutions. These can be extremely problematic in that there is no consultation, and they're trying to prescribe a solution. In the last, I grew up in the Bay Area where the Black Panthers were created, where the American Indian movement took over Alcatraz, and where numerous Asian American organizers were really built. And what we saw, if folks are able to kind of like study history, they can see that when different groups come together both in mutual protection, both from the state and from non-state actors, that's where our power can be built. That's where safety can be cultivated. Safety is not security. Safety is cultivated, security is enforced. In the last 18 months, what I've seen is on the ground, both in New York and Minneapolis, are BIPOC organizers, most especially Black trans organizers here in New York, Asian American organizers in Minnesota, finding bridges of solidarity with one another. What does it look like to keep us safe? And here in New York City, we're really honored to be able to work with the Asian American Federation in building out the Safety Ambassador Program. What we're hoping to do is build a cohort of 75 to 100 safety ambassadors. These are folks that are part organizers, part community outreach, and part community safety specialists that are going to be working within 3 communities here in New York City, in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, in predominantly Asian areas. We're going to be doing a training on October 24th, www.bit.ly/WeKeepUsSafe21. But I think it's really important for us to, when we're reimagining what safety looks like, one important thing is to understand that we have the agency and ability to define what that is and what that looks like on the ground. In our trainings, we talk about being pushed out of your window of tolerance, which I could talk about more later. But basically, when you're put in a trauma state, your agency is temporarily deprived of you. What we want to do is to reinforce that we have the ability, the skills, and the confidence to identify what safety looks like, not coming from a white supremacist, cis heteronormative perspective, but one that is grounded in addressing anti-Blackness. When we talk about situational awareness, it's important to identify potential threats that are based on anomalous behavior, not anomalous identities. One myth that we have been fed over the last 18 months is that it is the Black community versus the Asian community, when there have been studies done that it's primarily white folks that have been attacking our communities. So when we talk about mutual protection is about finding the intersections of identity, recognizing where we have power, where we have privilege, and also like where we show up for one another, and seeing that our struggles, our communities, and our lives are intertwined in this moment.
Thank you so much, Colin. And you got at a point which, you know, I'm interested in hearing what, you know, maybe Stephanie, Dr. Jeung, and Sarah have to say about this tension within our community around the role of law enforcement. That sometimes we might be talking to an elderly senior who's been isolated and terrified of going out, and they might find comfort in a uniformed officer. Whereas, you know, we've talked about this generational shift in how we perceive of law enforcement, and you know, my generation clearly sees that it is much more complicated than just, it's not a law enforcement issue, as you mentioned. So I'm interested, you know, maybe we can start with Stephanie about how, you know, maybe how that tension is manifested in your work or in those conversations that you've had to have, or, you know, just broadly, how you're seeing that conversation play out around law enforcement and the defund movement, especially when it comes to anti-Asian hate and the diversity of perspectives that we're hearing from within our community.
Sometimes people see it as just this generational thing, but it's not just generational. I feel like it's also about class and sort of like access to wealth, like neocon stuff as well. And so I think that I'm seeing that there are some people who are not realizing that actually this is the moment where we can, you know, sort of step into our power. And that whole point is that if we have that opportunity, then we should fund things that really get to building power for AAPIs that are looking at things like everyone's talking about across racial lines with real solidarity, not in like a sort of fake, you know, performative way, but in the ways that people had been doing it already. Like one of the stories that happened in Atlanta during the Black Lives Matter marches, they were happening in all these different places, and we had it happen in like a suburb, like an ethnoburb. And one of the, some of the Korean AAJCs had decided that they wanted to organize against the march. And so we had one of the organizers of the march go on Korean radio and talk about sort of like what his intention was. And he was saying very eloquently, I live in this community, police brutality, racial profiling, those things happen not just in the city of Atlanta, right? It happens everywhere. And so this issue matters to me. I want you to stand with me. This is a community effort. And it really changed the focus. Also because it was directly translated to in Korean, I think it also helped too. So it went from, you know, I don't know, 1 week where like you had all these like Korean business owners protesting and having this sort of whole petition going, to 2 weeks later, coming to the march, handing out waters, handing out masks, and being there in some capacity, and sort of seeing that it wasn't something to fight against, it's actually something to be a part of. There was also an older gentleman who spoke at the march, and he was a store owner during the uprisings in LA in the 90s, and he talked a lot about his regret. And he was crying and he was begging everybody to see like, this is actually the time for solidarity. For me as an older person, I didn't understand that I couldn't do it then. And now I see like basically kind of like regret and the error of my ways. And now I'm saying and seeing that the history is playing out again. And this is the time for real solidarity.
That definitely makes me think about a conversation I had with my dad after the George Floyd shooting. And he mentioned it pretty succinctly that when he came from India, racism was the price of admission. And it was such a dramatic reframing. Then like I was deeply uncomfortable, but it was such an eloquent way of simplifying just how he related to the injustices he saw. So yeah, that really hit close to home, like that mea culpa that you heard. And I feel like that would be incredibly powerful. Dr. Jeung, do you have something to add?
Yeah, you know, it is, you know, you're in regards to the question about policing and the diverse Asian American perspectives that we may have, it is really complicated as we talk about solidarity and about listening to everybody's voices to acknowledge that there are different political perspectives among the elderly, among young people, by ethnicity. And so how do we manage our own sort of political perspectives with also really empathetically listening to others, right? And that's the difficult thing. And then how do we have those conversations and teachable moments for each other, and for us to also learn that maybe we don't have the right perspective, or we can learn as well. So some lessons learned from Stop API Hate, it's really interesting. We wanted government to be collecting data because we think it's government's responsibility, right, to safeguard our community. That's why we pay taxes, but government didn't. And it's actually fortuitous that we, as Stop API Hate, created a reporting center that was community-based, right? We got we get so many more reports. And one of the first lessons learned is that we think people who respond to us don't necessarily want individual redress, which is such an American Western perspective, but they wanted collective justice. They wanted it to stop overall. They didn't want it just for themselves. They wanted a collective voice, which is really interesting. And so, so as we realized that people weren't reporting to law enforcement, people don't really expect government to do anything. What is government's role in addressing this anti-Asian racism, right? How do we hold government accountable? And then how do we reimagine community safety, like Kalyan said? And I think it's both for us an ongoing dialogue of trying to figure out, what does solidarity look like and safety look like at the neighborhood level for our elders, for our kids who have to go to schools on public transit. And it's not just the actual physical safety, but it's the fear of safety. It's the perception of safety that's really concerning for the adults, because even though, statistically elders may not be that endangered, their sense of being unsafe is what we have to deal with, right? Not just their actual safety. So it's an ongoing process, like we've all said, that we have to actually listen to each other and come up with community-wide solutions. But it's clear law enforcement and government, holding government accountable, isn't sort of the approach that I think the broader Asian American community is seeking. I mean, that's sort of the knee-jerk reaction. We need hate crimes legislation, we need enforcement, but I think I agree with Kyle that we need to reimagine it looks like. I really do support those community ambassador programs. We're going to write about it as a promising practice. So Sarah's got and can talk about the multiracial community ambassador programs in San Francisco. And so I think that is a new way of approaching it. And it's actually been evidence-based to work too.
Yeah, I think, I think we're all kind of commiserating around that quote from Kalyan that I think was posted in the chat: is safety is cultivated, but security is enforced. And I think that terminology is really, I think that really resonates with how a lot of us have interacted on this issue. But you referenced CYC. And so, Sarah, I'm interested in the Safety Ambassador Program and kind of the multicultural approach you're taking. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. We actually started this multicultural outreach type of approach in 2007 when we started doing a lot of school outreach. At that time, we were facing a lot of tension between different racial groups within the school. So we were able to reach out to our allies in the Black and Brown communities, that they also have outreach workers that know these young people coming from the neighborhood, that come together, that really talk about on the ground what they heard, what's going on, what the youth have been telling us, what we can do. We were actually doing ground level conflict mediation. We're always at the community hotspot or at the bus stop where they all get off from school and try to really mingle and get to know the students. I mean, the end of the day, I think it has to be a community-driven solution, because it's really about the human relationship. It's really about the relationship that you feel that they could feel like they can talk to an adult ally, that someone they can trust, that someone they know that won't throw them off the bus, and someone that will really be there for them. And from there, when we say we want to do conflict mediations or we want to do certain measures, that they will be in agreement. And we also take their input into whenever we're trying to do a conflict mediation. And then in terms of the community ambassador program we currently are doing, I totally agree. I think safety is really cultivated and security is enforced, that we really believe that it has to coming from the community. Many victims that we served, as I mentioned, since February, about 50 something of them, whether they're elders or they're young adults, either they have a reactions, they feel very grateful at that moment that someone actually give them a helping hand when the incident happened. It doesn't necessarily have to be intervened, but it could be after the incident that someone actually come up to them to see if they're okay, or if they need help to call a number or call 911 to seek help. And there are many of them that feel very disappointed because they felt like when at that moment, nobody really give them a helping hand and they feel very helpless. And those are the victims that feel most traumatized and most feel unsafe when they're actually outside in the community. So I think that's very key how we also empower our own community members that when something happens, how actually you can provide support or intervene or how to interact. I think the other thing that's very interesting is that when we have a multicultural team, which graciously funded by City County of San Francisco, that our Asian team, which represent like very diverse Asian community, that I have staff that could speak like Cantonese, Mandarin, Thai, Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Tagalog, and also pair up with our allies in the Latinx and also the Black community together. You feel a lot of version might be very like resistant about it. It's actually the other way. They actually felt like, oh, it's great. I know somebody from someone outside of my community. I see them all the time, but I never really get the chance to know them. I never know how to reach out to them for help. So we find that actually that's very effective, and people actually feel more comfortable that beyond their own community, they felt like other people, other community will also reach out and really build a bridge and ensure the safety of their own. I think that's something that very key that we see that's very successful. And obviously, we really address the anti-Blackness and anti-Asian sentiment also during our conversation and dialogue when we do the school and also community outreach.
That's something that's really interesting. Is I'd love to hear more from Satjeet, because I think there's a robust conversation in the chat box around the intersections of different kinds of violence. Like it's, this is not just a function of white supremacy in how we relate to it, but also white patriarchy and all these different ways that gender-based violence and all these different kinds of violence feed into each other and reinforce, community sentiments towards, these systemic injustices. And so Satjeet, I guess from your perspective, how are you seeing it in your work with the Sikh Coalition? I'm kind of biased. I'm really into the South Asian perspective because I've just had a few really interesting conversations with family members around this. So what can you speak to about the intersection of different kinds of violence?
Yeah, so one thing I'll start with is, there's different severity of violence as well. And sometimes it's very easy for us to talk about safety and reimagining what's next. But when it happens in that moment, community members will also rely on what they know as understanding what recourse looks like and what's next, and what that means for them. So we've worked with a lot of victims and survivors of hate crimes and their families, and their livelihoods have been taken, right? We've had people ram into storefronts and things like that. And they've been in hospitals for weeks on end. And for them, yeah, they want their idea of justice is actually a legal recourse that ends in punishment. And while that feeds into criminalization and the real challenges with our justice system here, or quote unquote justice system here in this country, and how it does criminalize Black and brown bodies at really substantial rates. But there has to be an understanding of the individual that is impacted and what needs they have and what justice means for them in that moment, and understanding you have to meet them where they are as well. Because the impact didn't actually happen to me, even though I have secondary, or the community has secondary trauma, right? The initial trauma, the initial impact, the initial livelihood losses on that individual. So I think that's really important to recognize and just understand in the larger conversations of, hate crime legislation or hate crime reporting and things like that, that needs to be recognized. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing, oh, sorry, the really quick second thing that I think gets to one of the points that you're making is also important, is what happens when violence happens within our communities, right? When it's a non-white person attacking, let's say, an Asian American, and then addressing their challenges of racism and colorism that happen in our own communities, right? Of it was a Mexican man or immigrant that came in and attacked me, or the only problems I've ever had are not with white people or Black people. And these are sentiments like I do hear in our community. And I'm sure every one of us have heard in our other communities, and like, what does that education actually require? So it's not just the severity of violence or the type of violence, but also the perpetrator, and understanding and helping our community understand the difference between an individual and a systemic racism and systemic white supremacy. And then like, how do we change dialogue between our communities and within our communities to address those issues, right? Like how much dialogue, and this is something that we've been talking about, when we're doing press releases and stuff like that, they're going to the standard traditional press, right? They're not necessarily going to community focused media outlets, right? And so is that a change that we need to start having, where it's actually some of our press releases and some of our content about educating others is actually going out to community focused groups and community focused media outlets instead. And so those are the two lenses that I would really encourage us to think about as we're also thinking about, the intersectionality of patriarchy and all these other things that do exist.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, my internet's just getting a little on a point about like the work that needs to happen in our, can you hear us?
Not now.
Okay, well, I'm gonna try to get the next about what community education looks like. Can you speak more to what you're seeing in your conversations and in your Did anyone hear me? Can you hear me? Oh. So I would just love to hear from Stephanie about the work that's being done. The work, I'm saying this out as I type it, but about the community education.
That we're doing in Atlanta?
It should be in the chat box. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
You're asking me, what is the community education work we're doing?
Yeah, that needs to take place around, systemic forms of racism and perception.
Okay, I think I got the gist of it. So I think, there's a couple things is, again, when I'm talking about, I guess this is a real time for reflection and change, is that as an Asian American community in this sort of general nonprofit industrial complex look, right? We actually have more money than we've ever had. We have more attention right now than we ever had, and actually some ways that we can utilize this money. What my fear is, right, is to repeat history and to, again, not put this money towards innovative projects, towards projects that are really funding smaller on the ground projects that are trying to get going. My fear is that we're not going to be able to move with real innovation and not to actually put young people's voices really at the front, not in a token way, but actually have them lead really significant pieces of the work. And I think I've been reflecting a lot about like just assimilation and sort of how those moments of assimilation has that we've internalized too as Asian Americans at different times, and that white is right, and this is where we need to sort of move forward. And my general reflection is that it is not serving us, and it has not served us. Mm-hmm. And so thinking now with where do we want to align ourselves as Asian Americans as a movement moving forward, and thinking about how do we really fully align ourselves, real conspirators with Movement for Black Lives. How do we actually think about ourselves And we want to get those messages out. Like I have a 7-year-old daughter. I've been talking to her about a lot of different things as well. And it's like, we need to think about what is our playbook? What is our agenda that we want to put out? We can actually get more folks involved if we're saying together, like, these are the principles that we really want to see. And it would not be absent of talking about, what somebody had mentioned in the chat is like, we have to look at the misogyny and in our own Asian American communities, right? And how that plays out. I was just on a call with some Asian American women, and the whole call was organized because we are Asian American leader women that have been harassed and doxxed and a whole bunch of other things. That was what the call was about, and for us as Asian American women to experience these kinds of things that are happening when you are vocal, when you speak out, when you really put it out there, that is kind of this sort of thing that you feel like you have to, like endure. And is really that the moment, is that what we organize, like around is, combating that. I mean, of course I'm going to get some hate and stuff, that's fine. But if we're looking at the larger sort of bigger picture of white supremacy, this is what I want to tackle, not just the lens of quote unquote Asian American, like anti-Asian hate. Anti-Asian hate is just one piece of it. The bigger picture, and I know all the panelists agree with this, is sort of combating white supremacy. And for us also, as nonprofit folks, is that getting funders to really see that this is the vision moving forward, and that's not that vision of funders saying that this is what needs to happen should not be the way that we run the needs of what's happening in the community. That needs to come from the community, and the community says and leads and says, this is what we want funded.
I think that opens up a broader question that I want to open up to everyone, really. I saw Kalyan with funders, with systems of power that we work within, and about the positionality of the experts on the ground. So maybe Kalyan, we can start off with you.
Yeah, I think so. One of the aims for the Safety Ambassador program is to really start building relationships with business owners, with community members, because safety and the work that we do really needs to be led by folks in the community. And I think that it's upon us as those that are within kind of the nonprofit industrial complex that does have access to these resources to see how we can route those resources to ensuring that there's long-term community-led solutions and not one-offs. One thing that we do at Nonviolent Peaceforce is ensure that we have a long, kind of like a long view in terms of like supporting communities, because it's not good enough to just parachute in and parachute out. And we need to be able to communicate that to funders in very clear ways. Just because this is a flashpoint moment, it should not just dissipate with that, because as we know, this country is built on violence. It's built on the genocide of Native Americans, enslavement of Africans, and the exploitation of Asian Americans, Latinx folks, and ongoing. So, sorry, I got really just like angry right now. I think that we need to think about in the Daisies Rising Up and Moving 5 steps of solidarity, how do we utilize the resources we have access to support those on the ground who do not have access to those resources?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Now I'm snapping my fingers, but I'm off camera trying to save my Wi-Fi. So, Sarah, Russell, Satjeet, I'm gonna try to unmute you all. So if you want, you can chime in too. Nothing? All right.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would like to add a little bit, just some experience that we have. I definitely support strongly that we should have long-term funding strategy or resources really for the grassroots organizations, because a lot of times they really don't have the capacity to do advocacy, but they are actually the organization or the community folks that actually will reach out to the community directly and really can lift up the voice and also the need of the community, because there's really no rubber stamp strategies, that each community should have its own like really tailored tailor-made strategy how to really ensure safety. I think one thing that for my experience with CYC for 24 years, I absolutely agree that a lot of times all these resources only react when something major happens, whether it's on the social media, whether there's a major news event, or maybe there's a major tensions that people notice. We have, as I mentioned, we started school outreach team back then because there were a lot of violence happening on the school ground, but that program stopped after 3 years because it's kind of quiet out. And then it really have shifted the focus to, focus on gun violence or focus on something else. And then we bring back this multicultural ambassador program last year because of the spike of the anti-Asian hate. So all this only happened when we are only being reactive, but not really having a long-term strategy that we can invest in our community, which I see that will become a cycle that we just have to reinvent the wheel every single time, while we already actually can build up with the ties across community and really ensure the safety in the long term. So I think that is something really key. 10 years ago, CYC also started a program at a neighborhood that predominantly resides with a Black community. And because of over the years, there's a lot of displacement. Many Asians also moved in the same neighborhood at Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. And when we decided to actually reach out to open a branch in the Bayview Hunters Point, we definitely had taken us 10 years, which is starting from 2011 and this year, 2021, to really build the bridges and partnership and trust within the community so that we can be around the table and really present a multicultural front together, that we were able to have like bus tour, cultural events, and have the residents have a safe space that they could actually mingle and get to know each other better. So it really takes a long time and takes really persistent effort and be loud out there to advocate and to really build the bridges so that we can really have anything change.
Mm-hmm. And it's this whole concept. Oh, go ahead, Satjeet.
Sorry, Ravi, I was going to say,
Oh,
I think the proactive piece is really important. So one of the things organizationally that we've been doing since, again, we've been around for 20 years now doing this work, is moving away from the reactive to the proactive. So obviously, we get over 200 requests for legal help on discrimination cases every single year, right? But how are we actually using litigation work to impact policy work? So again, you're like moving into that proactive stage. So Sikhs are not allowed to wear, Sikhs, Muslims, Jews that have beards, right? Like have real PPE issues right now. So when we're changing OSHA standards, right, how do we make sure religious accommodations are being met and in a way that's actually helpful so people are not forced to shave their beards? Okay, well, how are we thinking about just changing the understanding that most kids in this country even have of religious communities right from the get-go? Okay, that's K through 12 education. How are you making sure community members feel empowered to stand up for their rights, not just in a reactive situation, but in a proactive way, right? What is the organizing happening around that? And then like from a media perspective, right? How are we just changing the narrative? So it's like changing hearts and minds of how our communities are viewed, right? Like moving away from our stereotypes and sharing our stories with our own voices and doing that in every part, right? And I'm talking about not just like pitching articles, which we do a lot of, but also Hollywood, ads, DEI in corporate America, right? Like all of those spaces, like we need to power through because we should be writing those stories, not somebody else writing them for us, and it be fit into some stereotypical box that we never created.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to try to connect
please, I was just thinking about
what I've been hearing. So what I hear is like having a transformative vision of justice that could change the narrative, right? But it's got to come from the grounded experience of what we're dealing with and the current hate. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, and this may be a little bit abstract, but I've been wondering, like, why don't Asians report? Why don't they call the police, right? And then I think about, well, what do they expect the police to do? What do they hold government accountable to do? And then I think about, what is their vision of justice, right? What do they really hope for in their community? And that's for us, the transformative vision that we want. And we have to learn from our elders. And to see, I'm really focused on our elders because I have a grandfather I'm really worried about who lives next door, not my own, but who goes out in the streets daily in Oakland. And so for him, what's it look like for him to walk out in safety regularly? And what does he hope for himself and his family? And so I'm just arguing that this transformative vision I don't even understand, sorry, what our elders expect justice to look like. And I don't want to use a Western perspective that it's redress or it's carceral or it's even bright space, right? And so I think it is something different that we could reimagine. And as you talked about, changing the narrative is another key part of it. It's and then how do we give voices for people on the ground to actually get to the level of doing broad scale discursive narrative change, right? And I think that's what Stop API Hate has actually been a bridge to, is we collect stories of individuals who experience racism and we try to amplify them, right? To get it out into the broader discussion, and then to hear, this is how we're fearful, this is how we're attacked. But I want to go to this is what I would hope would happen. And that hope piece, that vision piece, I think that's what Asian American studies people need to be doing, is we got to really understand indigenous localized senses of justice, real imaginative perspectives, rather than just repeating the same old ways. And then we were talking a lot about, the notion of restorative justice and how we hold people accountable without incarcerating them or having punitive approaches. And I think that's the intermediate step for me, is for moving towards change from transformative justice, is to have a restorative justice approach. So I hope we could really promote those as a step towards that broader vision that we're hoping for. So just to sum it up, I think, we got to continue to listen to the ground and then come up with new visions of justice that we can articulate to change the narrative.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I'm taking from this panel is, in so many different ways, we have talked about this being an inflection point, that there is a long-term vision that is actionable, and that we are doing some mobilization work right now that, we've talked about how much this work has evolved over the past 20 years. And I'm still thinking about how different this work was, decades before that, when my parents first came here. And it's honestly been fascinating. So to kind of round out the conversation, I'd like to, hand the mic to all of you and hear, when we gather 1 year from now, what do you hope the landscape looks like for us? What do you hope to see different for our community or within our community 1 year from now? We can start the same way we started the panel. Kalyan, that's a big question. So if you want to sit with it for a little bit.
In 1 year's time, we will have listened and amplified and uplifted those at the margins and those at the intersection of the most marginalized identities. I just want to uplift Rohan Julie, who is a Black and Asian organizer here in New York City, that's building bridges of solidarity, that is really incorporating community safety and creating these spaces where Black and Asian communities and Blasian communities are going to be speaking with one another. I think it's really contingent on us to look at what that leadership looks like, because one thing that has really happened, in the past decade, really has been that Black leaders have once again, just like in the civil rights movement, have inspired and called us to action in ways where we see our struggles and our oppressions intertwined and our liberation intertwined. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the first thing on my head. Yeah.
No, you take the question and run with it. I love that. Yeah. And next, Sarah.
1 year is a very short time. You just haven't blink of eye. I do hope with our coalition on community safety and justice, we really hope that we can really identify the partners on the ground that could really come together as a network to really figure out some policy and also strategy, but also at the same time, how to really provide grassroots level support, capacity building. I think that's really lacked that what we've seen. I think it's also, I really hope that in 1 year's time that our school district that will actually give space for our young people to form their affinity groups to really promote more cross-cultural events, or as actually clubs that have the students that really have a chance that come together to talk about what they see, what they hear, and how to empower them. So those are the two hope I have for the young people at the community level.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Stephanie?
I hope that older people step aside and actually move on to a different role so that we can build up the real leadership and brilliance of young folks that are coming up. Still be around, still be, you know, as an old person myself, like still be around to help out, but not be the leader in the same way anymore. And I think that I'm looking forward to that. I'm also looking forward to see that sort of brilliance really bloom in really, you know, creative and innovative ways. And so I'm a Sagittarius, I'm very hopeful. So I always want to see some really brilliant things happening. And I can't wait to see that.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Speaking of the fellow Sagittarius, it's hard not to be optimistic all the time. Satjeet, what would you like to see in a year for our community?
The next year is the 1-year anniversary for Atlanta, for Indianapolis, which are like 6 weeks apart. It's insane. And it's the 10-year anniversary of Oak Creek. And so and it's also a midterm election. And so at each of these points, I would really like to see our communities stepping up in those local areas and using that as a moment to make some substantial asks and organize and do it in a way that creates change for years to come, right? So like, what are the asks that we're making in Indiana? What are the asks that we're making in Georgia? What are the asks that we're making in Wisconsin? And like, how do we replicate that across the board? And I will keep saying this, we have to bring our communities along for the ride, right? Like we represent really small segments of our communities, and we're not the ones locally setting up meetings. We're not the constituents for certain policy members, like all of that, right? And so it's really important that we bring them along for the ride. And these are the moments that you can do that in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, learning from the young people, like Stephanie said, I think this is what I hear. They want ethnic studies. And I think ethnic studies, by next year, I want to see it more required across the nation. I want to see it institutionalized. I want to see more curriculum developed. I wanted teachers trained. And like Satjeet just talked about, I think ethnic studies can be the issue by which we mobilize other communities around. And parents want it too, right? As a way to both stop API hate and as a way to build the movement. So I think for me, I'd like to see within a year more ethnic studies, because it requires a multiracial movement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I feel like this has been such an enlightening conversation. And I just love that we were able to approach this conversation from a variety of different positionalities in the work that you're doing, that we covered, a lot of the on the ground work that's being done. And then, we were talking a lot about the policy advocacy that needs to take place. And we covered that spectrum from organizing to policy advocacy and all of the work that any number of organizations and attendees can take part in here. So once again, thank you so much for a really fulfilling conversation. It's been really meaningful. As I said, my email, I'm sure you got busy days and, maybe you need to drop off, but I'd love it if you could stay for the workshops, which we're just going to get started. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be safe, y'all.
Thank you.